A photo of a statue depicting the figure of justice. Figure 2. One, their accuracy and practical use in the marketplace made scales, held aloft here by the figure of justice in Bruges, Belgium, a common symbol in jurisprudence and law in the East and the West. Even today, the concept of counterbalancing different ideas and philosophies underlies many approaches to the law and ethics. Credit: Modification of Golden Lady Justice by Emmanuel Heibrecht/Flicker, CC by 2. 0. Chapter Outline. 2.1. The Concept of Ethical Business in Ancient Athens. 2.2. Ethical Advice for Nobles and Civil Servants in Ancient China. 2.3. Comparing the Virtue Ethics of East and West. 2.4. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. 2.5. Deontology, ethics as duty. 2.6. A Theory of Justice. From the time of barter to the age of Bitcoin, most people engaged in business transactions have sought trust. Without trust, which is a fundamental outcome of ethical behavior, not just business relationships but all relationships would collapse. To develop insight into our own concepts of ethics, this chapter looks at how ethical systems have developed over time, beginning with the distinction between ethics and the law. Ethics are the standards of behavior to which we hold ourselves accountable in our personal and professional lives. Laws and regulations set the minimal standards by which society lives out those ethical norms. Because laws are minimal standards, it is not uncommon for an act to be legal but generally deemed unethical. The fact is that law and ethics are not always the same. Always, however, they are in dialogue, and each informs the other. The greatest challenge in business decision-making is moving beyond the letter of the law to create a culture of ethics. Figure 2.1. Can you identify a moment in your life when it was hard to follow your conscience, or your personal morality conflicted with societal norms? What was the nature of the conflict, and how did you approach it? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the role of ethics in ancient Athens, explain how Aristotelian virtue ethics affected business practices. It would be hard to overstate the influence of ancient Athens on Western civilization. Athenian achievements in the arts, literature, and government have molded Western consciousness. Perennial themes, such as the search for individual identity and each person's place in the world, appear in countless novels and Hollywood screenplays. The role of Athenian ethical theories in philosophy has been profound, and Athenian principles continue to be influential in contemporary philosophy. Ethics, as a form of applied philosophy, was a major focus among the leaders of ancient Athens, particularly teachers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They taught that ethics was not merely what someone did but who someone was. Ethics was a function of being, and, as the guiding principle for dealings with others, it naturally applied as well to the sensitive areas of money and commerce. Ancient Athens. Like a modern metropolis, the city-state polis of Athens in the 5th century BCE drew people from far afield who wanted a better life. For some, that life meant engaging in trade and commerce, thanks to the openness of the new democracy established under the lawgiver Cleisthenes in 508 BCE. Others were drawn to Athens' incredibly rich architecture, poetry, drama, religious practices, politics, and schools of philosophy. Youth traveled there hoping to study with such brilliant teachers as the mathematicians Archimedes and Pythagoras, dramatists like Sophocles and Euripides, historians Herodotus and Thucydides, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, and of course, the renowned but enigmatic philosopher Socrates. More than being the equivalent of rock stars of their day, these thinkers, scholars, and artists challenged youth to pursue truth, no matter the cost to themselves or their personal ambitions. These leaders were interested not in fame or even in personal development, but in the creation of an ideal society. This was the golden age of ancient Greece, whose achievements were so profound and enduring that they have formed the pillars of Western civilization for nearly 2.5 millennia. Philosophy, in particular, flourished during the Golden Age, with various schools of thought attempting to make sense of the natural and human worlds. The human world was thought to be grounded in the natural world, but to transcend it in striking ways, the most obvious being humans' use of reason and deliberation. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle tackled fundamental questions of human existence with such insight that their ideas have remained relevant and universal even at the dawn of artificial intelligence. As British mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947, observed, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. 1. Why are the insights of these Greek philosophers still relevant today? One reason is their development of the ancient concept of virtue, the person most closely associated with virtue in the West, and the development of what is now known as virtue ethics, that is, an ethical system based upon the exercise of certain virtues, loyalty, honor, courage, emphasizing the formation of character, is Plato's famous pupil Aristotle, 384–322 BCE. Figure 2. 2. Part A is a statue depicting Aristotle. Part B shows a print copy of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Figure 2, Nicomachean Ethics, by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle A, is a rough collection of Aristotle's lecture notes to his students on how to live the virtuous life and achieve happiness. It is the oldest surviving treatment of ethics in the West. The collection was possibly named after Aristotle's son. This 1566 edition B was printed in both Greek and Latin. Credit a modification of Aristotle Alltemps in 8575 by Jastrow/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of Aristoteles de Moribus ad Nicomachum by Avendra/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Aristotelian Virtue Ethics. For Aristotle, everything that exists has a purpose or end, and has been designed to meet that end. For instance, the proper end of birds is to fly, that of fish to swim. Birds and fish have been designed with the appropriate means, feathers, fins, to achieve those ends. Teleology, from the Greek telos meaning goal or aim, is the study of ends and the means directed toward those ends. What is the telos of human beings? Aristotle believed it to be eudaimonia, or happiness. By this, he did not mean happiness in a superficial sense, such as having fun or being content. Rather, he equated happiness with human flourishing, which he believed could be attained through the exercise of the function that distinguishes humans from the natural world: reason. 2. For Aristotle, reason was supreme and best used to increase not wealth but character. But what is happiness? He asked. If we consider what the function of man is, we find that happiness is a virtuous activity of the soul. 3. However, because humans are endowed not only with reason, but also with the capacity to act in an honorable and ethical manner, they may reject their end, either intentionally or by default. The great task of life, then, is to recognize and pursue happiness, no matter the constraints placed on the individual, the most dramatic of which are suffering and death. Birds and fish have little difficulty achieving their ends, and we can assume that much of this is due to their genetic coding. Because happiness might not be genetically encoded in human beings, they must learn how to be happy. How do they do that? According to Aristotle, eudaimonia is achieved by leading a virtuous life, which is attained over time. Happiness is a kind of activity, and an activity clearly is developed and is not a piece of property already in one's possession. 4. Aristotle identified two types of virtues, which the philosophical community of his day agreed were objective and not subjective. The two types were intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtues, including knowledge epist letter 1e17 macron, wisdom sophia, and most importantly for Aristotle, prudence phronesis, or practical wisdom, served as guides to behavior. That is, a person acted prudently based on the wisdom gained over time through the ongoing acquisition and testing of knowledge. To give an oversimplified but practical application of Aristotelian thinking, a hiring manager acts prudently when assessing a pool of candidates based on knowledge of their backgrounds and on insight gained after years of working in that role. The manager may even use intuitive reason regarding a candidate, which Aristotle believed was another way of arriving at truth. Understood in this way, the manager's intuition is an impression regarding character and someone's potential fit in an organization. Among the intellectual virtues, prudence played the major role because it helped individuals avoid excess and deficiency and arrive at the golden mean between the two. Prudence has been translated as common sense and practical wisdom, and helps individuals make the right decision in the right way at the right time for the right reason. In Aristotle's view, only the truly prudent person could possess all the moral virtues. The distinction Aristotle made is that the intellectual virtues are acquired purely through learning, whereas the moral virtues are acquired through practice and the development of habits. In contrast to the intellectual virtues, which focused on external acts, the moral virtues had to do with character. They included courage, self-control, liberality, magnificence, honor, patience, and amiability. Some of these virtues had different meanings in ancient Greece than they do today. Liberal, for instance, referred not to a political or economic stance, but rather to an aspect of personality. Someone would be considered liberal who was open and sharing of him or herself, and his or her talents without fear of rejection or expectation of reciprocity. The paragon of these virtues was the magnanimous individual, someone for whom fame and wealth held little attraction. 5. This person had self-knowledge, was not rash, quick to anger or submissive to others, and acted with self-respect, control, and prudence. The magnanimous individual achieved happiness by leading a life characterized by reason and will. He or she remained in control of self and did not hand over his or her authority or moral agency to others, whether in judgment or in decision-making. So, magnanimity seems to be a sort of crown of the virtues because it enhances them and is never found apart from them. This makes it hard to be truly magnanimous because it is impossible without all-round excellence, according to Aristotle. 6. The relationship between the intellectual and the moral virtues was not as clear-cut as it may appear, however, because Aristotle believed that action preceded character. In other words, the primary way to change character was through consistent, intentional behavior in the direction of virtue. Aristotle gave the example of courage. A person was not courageous first and then went about performing acts of courage. Rather, courage resulted from incremental change, small steps taken over time that molded the person's character. It relied on a recognition of justice, so that courage was directed toward the right end. The important task was developing the habit of leading the virtuous life. Anyone could do this. However, it was a discipline that had to be learned and practiced with dedication. We can see that this habit of virtue is especially relevant for business today, when the temptation to conform to an established organizational culture is overwhelming, even when that culture may permit and even encourage questionable practices. Add the seductive power of money, and anyone's courage might be tested. The most notable feature of virtue ethics is that it viewed the basic ethical unit, the fundamental agent of morality, as the individual who lived out his or her worldview publicly. A life of virtue, therefore, took place in the economic and political spheres so that others might participate in and benefit from it. In Athenian society, it was important for business to be conducted competently and ethically. Even though Aristotle was suspicious of business, he acknowledged its importance in preserving and nurturing Athenian democracy. He also praised the creation of money to further the goal of justice, so that a shoemaker and a housebuilder, for instance, could trade their wares on an equal basis. Virtue in the marketplace was demonstrated through ethical behavior, according to Aristotle. People do in fact seek their own good and think that they are right to act in this way. It is from this belief that the notion has arisen that such people are prudent. Presumably, however, it is impossible to secure one's own good independently of domestic and political science. 7. This belief in the public nature of virtue was crucial for the flourishing of the city-state, and also has implications for contemporary business, which must consider the individual, organization, industry, and society in its development and planning. Ethics across time and cultures. Athenian democracy. Just as time and place influence people's perception of ethics, so is their understanding of democracy also subjective. You might be surprised to learn the Athenian version of democracy was significantly different from our own. For instance, although the word democracy comes from the Greek for people, dermos, and power, kratos, only adult men who owned property could vote, and voting was direct. Athens was not a republic with elected representatives like the United States. Resident aliens or metics, those who changed their home, were not eligible for citizenship and could not vote. They had limited rights and their status was second class, although this did not stop many of them from attaining wealth and fame. They were often among the best artisans, craftspeople, and merchants in the city-state. Metics were able to conduct business in the marketplace agra, provided they paid special taxes yearly. One of the most famous was Aristotle, who was born outside Athens in northern Greece. Women, even those who were citizens, were not allowed to vote and had limited rights when it came to property and inheritance. Their primary function in Athenian society was the care and management of the home. The Athenian woman must be the perfect Penelope, a partner to the husband, a guard of the house, and one who practices the virtues defined by her husband. Physical beauty was not to be a goal, nor was it even a primary valued attribute. Total dedication to the welfare of husband, children, and household was the ultimate virtue. 8. Figure 2-3. A painting depicting a woman on the left, Penelope, and a man on the right, Odysseus. Another person is behind Odysseus looking back at them. Figure 2-3. Penelope and Odysseus in a scene from Homer's Odyssey, as depicted in 1802 by the German painter Johann Tischbein. For the ancient Greeks, Penelope represented all the virtues of a loving, dutiful partner. She remained faithful to her husband Odysseus despite his absence of some 20 years during and after the Trojan War. Credit: Odysseus and Penelope by H.R. Wacker and James Stakely / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Finally, not all transactions were as straightforward as selling Egyptian linen, dried fruit, or spices. Slave traders, too, brought their wares to market. Slavery was a customary part of many cultures throughout the ancient world, from Persia to Arabia and Africa and China. In Athens and its surrounding area, it is estimated that during the Golden Age, 5th century BCE, there were 21,000 citizens, 10,000 metics, non-native Athenians who still shared some of the benefits of citizenship, and 400,000 slaves. 9. Despite the Athenian emphasis on virtue and honor, there was little or no objection to owning slaves, because they formed an indispensable part of the economy, providing the labor for agriculture and food production. Slavery persists even today. For instance, it is believed that nearly 30 million people worldwide are living and working as slaves, including 3 million in China and 14 million in India. 10. Servitude also exists for migrant workers forced to live and work in inhuman conditions, without recourse to legal help, or even the basic necessities of life. Such conditions occur in industries as diverse as commercial fishing in Southeast Asia and construction in Qatar. 11. Critical thinking. Consider how democracy has expanded since the Golden Age of Greece, eventually including universal suffrage and fundamental rights for everyone. Although we try not to judge cultures today as having right or wrong practices, we often judge earlier cultures and civilizations. How might you assess a practice like slavery in antiquity without imposing modern values on a civilization that existed more than 2.5 millennia ago? Are there absolute truths and values that transcend time and space? If yes, where might these come from? If not, why not? Honorable behavior in business. The common belief in ancient Greece that business and money were somehow tainted reflected Plato's concept that the physical world was an imperfect expression, or shadow, of the ideal. Everything in the physical world was somehow less than the ideal, and this included the products of human thought and labor. For example, a cow exists in the physical world as an imperfect and temporary expression of the ideal essence of a cow, what we might call cowness. This imperfection accounted for the many variations found in the earthly creature. Business, as a human invention based on self-interest, also had no appreciable ideal or end. After all, what was the purpose of making money if not having more money? Any end beyond that was not evident. In other words, money existed simply to replicate itself and was fueled by avarice, the love of money, or greed, the love of material goods. As for the life of the businessman, it does not give him much freedom of action. Besides, wealth is obviously not the good that we are seeking because it serves only as a means, i.e., for getting something else, said Aristotle. 12. Yet business had an interesting effect that helped invigorate Athenian life and encouraged those engaged in it to be virtuous, or else risk their reputation. This effect was association. Business was based on the free and fair exchange of goods, which brought not only items of merchandise into association with each other, but also buyers, sellers, and public officials. The way to ensure ethically sound association was through the exercise of prudence, especially in its demand that people act not rashly but deliberately. This deliberative aspect of prudence provided a way for buyers, sellers, and everyone engaged in a transaction to act honorably, which was of the utmost importance. Honor was not only a foundational virtue, but the cultural environment in which the ancient world existed. One of the worst offenses anyone could commit, whether man, woman, free, or slave, was to act in a dishonorable way. Of course, although acting deliberately does not guarantee that one is acting honorably. For Athenians, acting in a calculated way was not an indication of dishonor. Dishonorable acts included any that disturbed the basic order dike of life in which everyone had a role, including the gods. Interestingly, the Aristotelian approach to business did not condemn money-making or the accumulation of riches. What concerned Aristotle, particularly because of its harmful effects on the individual and the city-state, was greed. Aristotle considered greed an excess that tipped the scales of justice and led to scandal. Money might constitute the bait, but greed causes the person to reach out and grab as much as possible, falling into the trap of scandal. The Greeks considered the exercise of greed an irrational, and therefore ignoble, act. Only attention to honor and deliberative prudence could save someone from acting so foolishly. Honor in ancient Greece was not just an individual characteristic, but also a function of the group to which an individual belonged, and the person derived self-esteem from membership in that group. Civic virtue consisted of honorable living in community. Business scandals today often arise not from conflicts of interest, but from conflicts of honor in which employees feel torn by their allegiance to a coworker, a supervisor, or the organization. 13. Although few people would use the term honor to describe contemporary workplace culture or corporate mission, nearly everyone understands the importance of reputation and its impact, positive or negative, on a business. Reputation is no accident. It is the product of a culture formed by individual and group effort. That effort is directed, intentional, and ongoing. According to Aristotle and later thinkers who expanded upon his work, such as 13th-century philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, to act dishonorably casts disrepute on all concerned. Ends and means had to be aligned, particularly in business, which provided people's livelihoods and secured the economic health of the city-state. Acting honorably meant trying to be magnanimous in all transactions and rising above obsession with baser instincts. The honorable person was magnanimous, prudent, fair, and interested in self-advancement, as long as it did not injure personal integrity or the body politic. The importance of prudence is evident because, said Aristotle, it is concerned with human goods, i.e., things about which deliberation is possible. For we hold that it is the function of the prudent man to deliberate well, and nobody deliberates about things that cannot be otherwise, or that are not means toward an end, and that end is a practical good. And the man who is good at deliberation generally is the one who can aim, by the help of his calculation, at the best of the goods attainable. 14. Aquinas further divided Aristotelian prudence into memory, reason, understanding, docility, shrewdness, foresight, circumspection, and caution. 15. To use these qualities in a constructive way, a business person had to direct them toward an appropriate end, which applies to business today just as it did in 4th century Athens. A merchant could not make money in a random way, but had to keep the needs of customers in mind and conduct business with fair prices and fees. This exercise of prudence was part of the cosmic order that ensured the right management of the home, the marketplace, and civilization itself. Similarly, committing fraud or deception to achieve an end, even if that end were good or just, was not considered an honorable act. Only when ends and means were aligned and worked in harmony were those engaged in the transaction considered virtuous. This virtue, in turn, would lead to the happiness Aristotle envisioned and toward which his entire system of virtue ethics aimed. Ethics across time and cultures. 3 forms of justice. Along with honor, justice, as depicted in the image at the beginning of this chapter, formed part of the cultural environment of Athenian society. Citizens often relied on litigation to settle disputes, particularly conflicts over business transactions, contracts, inheritance, and property. Justice existed in 3 forms as it does today: legal, commutative, and distributive. In legal justice, the city-state was responsible for establishing fair laws for the welfare of its citizens. Commutative justice characterized relationships among individuals. Courts attempted to correct harms inflicted and return what had been unlawfully taken away from plaintiffs. Distributive justice governed the duty of the city-state to distribute benefits and burdens equitably among the people. We can see these forms of justice at work today in very practical ways. For instance, within the framework of commutative justice, businesses are often held responsible ethically and financially for any harm caused by their products. And distributive justice is debated in such hotly contested issues as corporate and individual tax rates, universal health coverage, state and federal income assistance, subsidized housing, Social Security eligibility, college tuition aid e.g., Pell Grants, and similar programs designed to create a safety net for those least fortunate. Some safety net programs have been criticized for their excessive cost, inefficiency, and unfairness to those who pay into them while receiving no benefit or say in their administration. Critical thinking. How is the ancient concept of distributive justice understood in today's political debate? What are the underlying values that inform each side of the debate, e.g., values like wealth maximization and corporate social responsibility? Can these sides be reconciled, and, if so, what must happen to bring them together? Does virtue have a role to play here? If so, how? Link to learning. For a further discussion of justice, read this article on justice and fairness from the Marcula Center for Applied Ethics. How, exactly, did honor and deliberative prudence prevent someone from acting foolishly in life and unethically in business? And what does it look like to follow these virtues today? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the key features of Confucian virtue ethics, Explain how Confucian virtue ethics can be applied to contemporary business. The teachings and writings of Confucius, 551–479 BCE, also called Kung Fu Tzu or Master Kung, not only have endured more than 2.5 millennia, but have influenced Chinese culture to such a degree that they remain part of the national character. In classical Confucianism, the practice of virtue constitutes the essence of governance. Differing from Aristotelian virtue, Confucian virtue emphasizes relationships. Aristotle shows how a self-determining person might live well in society. Confucius showed how a relationship-determining person can live well with others. The reasons for this distinction will become clearer throughout the section. As an iconic figure, Confucius had an impact on politics, literature, civil administration, diplomacy, and religion in China. Yet, by most accounts, he considered himself a failure, never having achieved the position and security he sought during his lifetime. However, his story is a testament to the reward of a life lived with integrity and simplicity. Social upheaval in ancient China. More than a century and a half before Aristotle, and on the other side of the globe, Confucius, a wandering preacher from the Principality of Lu in China, also struggled to answer life's questions, although in a practical rather than a philosophical way. Confucius committed himself to healing the social divisions that were tearing China apart under the declining Zhou dynasty. Those divisions led to what historians call the period of the Warring States, which persisted for 200 years after Confucius's death. It was a time of constant warfare and violence. 16. To counter the social disintegration he found everywhere, Confucius looked to the past, or the wisdom of the ancients. He called for a return to Li, which was the proper order of the universe in which everyone had a role to play and there was harmony in the world. 17. We might see this harmony in a contemporary business setting, as a team of people bringing different talents to bear on a specific project for the good and profit of the company. In this sense, Li refers to doing those tasks in collaboration with others to achieve the mission of the organization. For Confucius, Li was expressed through ritual acts. When the correct rituals were followed in the right way with the right intention for the right end, all was well. Of course, corporate rituals also exist, and like all ritual acts, they reinforce cohesion and identity within the group. Identifying them helps improve employee awareness, productivity, and perhaps happiness. One example of this would be new employee orientation, which is intended to acclimate newcomers to the corporate culture, the company ethos, and the traditions associated with the way the firm does business. Finally, anticipating Aristotle's golden mean, Li emphasized the middle ground between deficiency and excess. Nothing in excess was its guiding principle. 18. Huston Smith, noted historian of world religions, has observed that the widespread adoption of Confucius's teachings within a generation of his death was not due to the originality of his ideas. 19. What made the humble scholar the greatest cultural force in China's history was chance. Confucius appeared on the scene at the right time, offering a fractured country an alternative to two extremes, neither of which was working. These were a realism that was tyrannical and relied on brute force to restrain the rivaling factions, and an idealistic approach called Moism that was based on universal love and mutual aid. Confucius rejected the first as crude and the second as utopian. 20. Instead, he offered a practical but empathetic approach, a sort of tough love for the times. Link to learning. Read this article that gives a helpful historical background on Confucianism to learn more. Confucian virtue ethics. Scholars believe that, like Aristotle, Confucius stressed the virtuous life in his ethical system, with the goal of creating a junzi, or a person who was gracious, magnanimous, and cultured. In other words, a flourishing human being. A junzi exhibited refinement, self-control, and balance in all things, acting neither rashly nor timidly. Such a person was the opposite of a small individual, who spent his or her time embroiled in petty rivalries, and for whom power was the ultimate measure of success. The concept of Junzi and the Aristotelian magnanimous individual have much in common, except that for Confucius, there was added urgency. To be a Junzi was a matter not just of honor but of survival. It is no exaggeration to say that China's very existence depended upon the ability of individuals, nobles and peasants alike, to rise above the barbarity around them and embrace a way of life directed both outward towards social, political, and administrative reform, and inward towards spiritual development. Confucius, Figure 2.4, believed that living the virtues he taught would achieve both these ends. A photo of a statue depicting Confucius that is in front of the Confucius Temple. Figure 2. For Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu, or Master Kung, depicted here in front of the Confucius Temple in Beijing, lived during a turbulent period in China's history. He sought to end violence and chaos through a return to order, harmony, and reverence, especially within the family. Credit, Kongzai, Confucius Temple with Gold Roof Main Statue by Claritite Plate Shop. com/Flickr, cc by 20. The keystone of Confucius's deliberate tradition was the Tao of humanity, or the Way, which established humanity as the answer to rampant lawlessness. 21. Confucius believed people were inherently good, and that the way to stop inhuman behavior was to make them even better, or more human. He identified 3 means to do this, which we explore next: wholehearted sincerity and truthfulness, the constant mean, and expediency, quan. 22 specific virtues like moral character, righteousness, wisdom, courage, respect, filial piety, and simplicity formed part of these means. Someone who lived virtuously became more human, which resulted in a flourishing individual and an ordered world. Wholehearted sincerity and truthfulness meant more than sincerity, because even liars can be convincing. The sincerity Confucius had in mind was closer to loyalty, and the thing to which humans had to be loyal was truth. Confucius intended to counter the blind loyalty that had contributed to the eruption of anarchy throughout China. For instance, if a subject were called upon to offer advice, the subject had to be truthful, even though the ruler might not like the advice, which actually happened to Confucius, causing him to resign his post as Minister of Justice in Lu. 23. What a subject owed the ruler was not cloying deference but the truth, which would benefit everyone in the long run. The implications for ethical behavior in modern corporations may be obvious. Reporting unethical behavior as a whistleblower or even standing up for truth in a meeting is sometimes easier said than done, which is why living virtuously requires disciplined practice and the support of like-minded individuals. The constant mean refers to balance between excess and deficiency in an existential and in a practical sense. We are to follow the middle path, avoiding extremes of thought and action through ritual acts. We cannot claim to lead a balanced life. We must show it by performing acts that maintain personal and collective order. The Book of Li catalogues many of these acts, which form a guide for proper living, indicating the correct way to maintain the 5 great relationships that support Chinese society: parent-child, husband-wife, elder-junior sibling, master-apprentice, and ruler-subject. Confucius and his peers believed that properly observing these key 5 relationships was essential for social good and would invoke divine favor on the people. Note that 3 of these are relationships within the family. The family was the basic unit of society and Confucius's hope for reform, because it was the primary and most influential school of character, virtue, and conscience. Thus, the return to Li takes on greater significance than a simple longing for an idyllic past. As Huston Smith noted, that 3 of the 5 relationships pertain within the family is indicative of how important Confucius considered this institution to be. In this, he was not inventing but continuing the Chinese assumption that the family is the basic unit of society. This assumption is graphically embedded in Chinese legend, which credits the hero who invented the family with elevating the Chinese from the animal to human level. 24. What would you do, Yijing? The 5 great relationships upon which Chinese civilization is built prescribed definite roles for the social classes and sexes. As in ancient Greece, women in ancient China were in charge of domestic duties and care of the family. They were neither expected nor believed able to assume duties outside the home, and certainly not in the competitive world of business. Yet consider the fictional case of Yijing. Yijing was the daughter of the merchant Bei Li, who sold farming tools and agricultural products in Cao, which bordered Lu. Bei Li's business was very successful, and he took great pride in it. He had 3 sons who worked with him, but none had the head for business that his daughter Yijing had. Moreover, none of them wanted to take over the business after his death. When Yijing begged for a chance to run the business for her father, he agreed, but he insisted she disguise herself as a man when traveling and doing business in the family name. If people knew she was a woman, they would ridicule the family and take advantage of her. Although surprised by her father's request, Yijing agreed and eventually took over the business, making it extremely prosperous. Critical thinking. If you were Yijing, what would you have done? For Confucius, the third approach to the way of humanity was the doctrine of expediency. Where Buddhism and Taoism advocated compassion and Moism advocated universal love, Confucianism defined righteousness as the virtue that would temper compassion and love so that people could live together not just peacefully but justly. 25. Righteousness included a practical approach to problem solving that helped politics, diplomacy, and civil administration to flourish. This expediency, or quan, is a noteworthy feature of Confucianism. Originally referring to a piece of metal used in balancing scales, quan is applied when weighing options in a moral dilemma and acts as a counterbalance to achieve fairness, enabling parties in a transaction to arrive at an equitable agreement. Ultimately, quan allows people and institutions to prioritize responsive action over ritual and serves as the way to align what people do with who they are, thus allowing them to become more human. For the business person, it might mean not fleeing the tawdry world of the marketplace, but recognizing the humanity within it. One example of the use of quan is the Broad Group, a Chinese manufacturer of central air conditioning products. The company produces clean energy systems and has developed an alternative to Freon. The new coolant has changed the way energy is delivered to such an extent that Zhang Yue, the company's chief executive officer, was awarded the Champions of the Earth Prize by the United Nations in 2011 for his work in green energy. 26. Certainly, there is more opportunity for sustainable manufacturing and ethical business practices throughout China, and the state is attempting to promote such efforts. A Confucian business model. The spirituality that emerges from quan as righteousness is not solely about the individual. It is about the act itself. That is, the transaction, whether that takes place in a market, shop, or loading dock. When righteousness is directed outward in this way, it becomes justice, compelling all parties in a transaction to act in good faith or risk upsetting the proper order of things. Justice in this sense allows for wealth creation, investment, and strategic planning as long as all fulfill their roles and act in the manner of a junzi. An overarching spirituality of business may even develop, arising from the people who collectively make up the company. This is a traditionally Confucian way of looking at corporate culture, as the reflection of a larger network of relationships. The other 2 Confucian ways of humanity also relate to business, because wholeheartedness and sincerity can serve as models of risk assessment, requiring clear-headed thinking and action balanced with respect for markets, competitors, and stakeholders. The Tao of humanity rejects the premise that greed reigns supreme by itself. Instead, its ethical counterpart is truth. Both qualities exist within business practices. In this ethical framework, loyalty to truth is not just a stock phrase but a commitment to value in all aspects of an enterprise. such as sales, finance, marketing, and the employment and hiring chain. An investment advisor might recommend the constant mean to clients so their money is in a diversified portfolio with a long-term strategy. The Tao of humanity, wholeheartedness, sincerity, and the other virtues are treated in the Analects, Figure 2. 5. A piece of bamboo has Chinese characters written in ink that are organized into columns. Figure 2.5. The Analects of Confucius is a collection of Confucius's teachings and sayings regarding the virtuous life and how to attain harmony. They were compiled by his followers and written with ink and brush on strips of bamboo. Credit: Rongo Analects 2 by Fucutaro/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Some have criticized Confucianism for impeding progress in China in areas like education, the natural sciences, and business, because it has failed to adapt to the modern context. High-frequency trading, blockchain technology, artificial intelligence, and robotics do not work with cultural values thousands of years old, these critics say. So what we need is a new consciousness for a new era in human history. However, these criticisms miss the point. Confucius was interested in the same thing that concerned Aristotle, namely, the character of the person or persons making decisions rather than the decisions themselves. The importance of character has been proven repeatedly through business scandals like Enron, LIBOR, and the 2008 financial crisis, as well as the recent problems of Uber and Volkswagen, in which personal irresponsibility resulted in disaster. Indeed, business schools now offer seminars for executives integrating virtue ethics, both Aristotelian and Confucian-inspired models, in leadership development. Link to learning. For a concise breakdown of the rise and collapse of Enron, see the video, Enron, the biggest fraud in history. The recent campaign of China's central government against unethical business practices has made a point of prosecuting executives for corruption in the form of bribery, kickbacks, and embezzlement, demonstrating that some Confucian thought has survived from ancient times. Jack Ma, co-founder of the giant Chinese e-commerce site Alibaba, has called this clean communism, which might be another way of characterizing the form of state-sponsored capitalism that exists in China. 27. Of course, the former communist regime did not embrace Confucian virtue. Mao Zedong was deeply suspicious of Confucius, holding him to be a relic of the imperial era, and having little value for the new China he intended to create with the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Link to learning. To what extent are children in China responsible for their parents' businesses? In this article, Kelly Zhang, daughter of billionaire Zhang Qinghua, explains how she believes modern-day China has lost its soul through selfish individualism and an obsession with wealth. If Kelly Zhang is correct, would it be safe to say that China needs another return to ancient wisdom? Why or why not? Do you agree with her assessment of the current generation and individualism? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to compare the origins and goals of virtue ethics in the East and the West. Describe how these systems each aimed to establish a social order for family and business. Identify potential elements of a universally applied business ethic. Aristotle and Confucius each constructed an ethical system based on virtue, with Aristotle's ultimate aim being happiness and Confucius's being harmony. Each addressed a particular problem. For Aristotle, happiness consisted of the search for truth, which, in turn, required a centered, stable individual who could surmount misfortune or weak character. Confucius looked to settle the soul of the Chinese people by creating a system that reflected the heavenly order on earth. Both systems rely on reasoned means to achieve reasoned ends. East meets West. Given the vastly different cultural and historical settings of ancient Greece and China, you may be surprised to find similarities between the Aristotelian and Confucian systems of virtue ethics. Yet not only are there similarities, but the two systems share the theme of control. For Aristotle, control manifested itself through the deliberative process of phronesis, resulting in virtuous living, harmony, and happiness. This application of practical wisdom was related to self-restraint, or temperance. In Confucian virtue ethics, control was a function of self-regulation. Primitive instincts were held at bay, and the person gained the capacity and courage to act more humanely. Figure 2. 6. This achievement of control benefited not only the individual but also the family and, by extension, the nation. Self-regulation was Confucius's way of establishing order. A chart has 4 rows and 3 columns. The first row is a header and labels the table as control. The second row is a header row. The first column header is blank, the second is Aristotle, and the third is Confucius. Under the first column, the categories are characteristics and behavior. Under the column Aristotle are the words phronesis, self-restraint, temperance, and virtuous living, harmony, happiness. Under the column Confucius are the words self-regulation, ability, courage, and junzi, humanity. Figure 2. 6. The Aristotelian and Confucian systems of virtue ethics have in common the theme of control, as this comparison shows. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. In a business context, control bears directly on managerial ethics, which is a way of relating to self, employees, and the organization that balances individual and collective responsibility, and in which management also includes planning, organizing, and leading to achieve organizational goals. 28. A self-controlled, disciplined manager is able to work through layers of bureaucracy and the complexities of human interaction to attain goals in a way that is responsible and profitable, and that enhances the organization's mission and culture. These goals are achieved not at the expense of stakeholders, but in a way that is fair for all. We might even say that righteousness leads to justice, which includes profit. We saw earlier that neither Aristotle nor Confucius disapproved of profit as long as it benefited humanity in some way. Both men would have a very definite opinion about the optimization of shareholder wealth. Despite these similarities between the two traditions, there are differences, the most notable being the locus of ethics. Aristotle placed this locus on individuals who were called to fulfill their purpose honorably, accepting fate with dignity and aplomb. The basis of this acceptance was reason. For Confucius, reflecting the historical plight of China, the locus was the family, which he envisioned as putting an end to anarchy and setting the nation on its proper course by providing the basic pattern of relationships for personal and professional life. To be sure, family counted for Aristotle just as the individual counted for Confucius, but the emphasis in each system was different. Aristotle acknowledged that a solitary man has a hard life because it is not easy to keep up a continuous activity by oneself, but in company with others and in relation to others it is easier. 29. Regardless of the source of ethical behavior, those engaged in business were required to act with accountability and responsibility. They were accountable to customers and suppliers when delivering commodities like figs, pottery, or olive oil, and they had to conduct themselves responsibly to maintain their personal and professional reputation. Thus, business was the perfect expression of ethics in both East and West, because it provided a forum within which virtues were tested in very real ways. Confucius urged each follower to be a great or humane person, or not a small one. 30. This was so important that the school established after his death was known as the Ru School, and the principles it taught are called Ruism. 31. Personal and professional roles. Another important characteristic of Eastern and Western systems of virtue ethics is the integration of personal and professional life. A person could not act one way at home and a completely different way in public, especially civic leaders, merchants, teachers, and rulers. The modern tendency to compartmentalize various aspects of ourselves to accommodate circumstances would have puzzled those living in ancient Greece or China. A retail manager who contributes generously to help protect endangered species, but thinks nothing of working the sales staff to the point of burnout to achieve monthly goals, has not successfully integrated the personal and the professional, for instance, and even poses obstacles to individual happiness and life in the community. Everyone desires efficiency in business, but compartmentalizing our personal and professional ideals can lead to dispersed personal accountability in an organization and the kind of financial meltdown that occurred through greed and rule breaking in the housing and financial industries and led to the worldwide recession of 2008. 32. What might the integration of personal and professional life look like, and how can we apply it within the relationships that are the foundation of business? To answer this question, consider the essence of the virtuous person that each ethical system strove to create. For Aristotle, the virtuous person saw the truth in every kind of situation. Once acknowledged and recognized, the truth could not be denied without compromising honor. Similarly, Confucius taught that a gentleman will not, for the space of a meal, depart from humanity. In haste and flurry he adheres to it. In fall and stumble he adheres by it. 33. Despite the emphasis these systems placed on character, however, character was not ultimately what defined the virtuous individual, family, city-state, or nation. Instead, it was the individual's transformation, through education, into a different kind of being who will act virtuously even if no one is watching. When the person concentrates on the means used to achieve an end, eventually, the means become a way of life even more important than the end itself. It is not merely that the means must match the end, but that they come to define the virtuous person. The integration of personal and professional lives has two effects: motive and awareness. Motive is the willingness to do the right thing because it is the right thing, even though there may be no perceived benefit. Arguably, it is here that the individual's true nature is revealed. The other effect, awareness, is the ability to see the ethical dimension in all events, choices, decisions, and actions. Many business scandals could be avoided if more people understood the value of human capital and the need to see the larger picture. To put it differently, responsibility over profitability, or, as Confucius would say, it is the person who can broaden the way, not the way that broadens the person. 34. Is there a universal ethics? A fundamental question in the study of ethics is whether we can identify universal, objective moral truths that cut across cultures, geographic settings, and time. At the most foundational level, the answer might be yes. As Aristotle noted, ethics is not a science but an art. 35. Perhaps the best way to answer the question is to consider the methods used for moral decision-making. This strategy would be in line with Aristotelian and Confucian models if we assume that once they attain insight, most people will follow their conscience and act in reasonable, responsible ways. Methods of decision-making then could be adapted to any context or dilemma. But what constitutes a reasonable, responsible method, and who gets to choose it? It is possible that standards of ethical conduct could be created to guide business affairs fairly and justly. Such standards already exist in most industries and professions. The generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, give direction to those working in accounting and finance in the United States. The International Standards Organization offers guidelines and protocols for many industries. Together with governmental regulation, these might serve as the basis for ethical behavior, perhaps even globally. Of course, those fashioning guidelines would have to be sensitive to individual autonomy and national sovereignty, especially when it comes to international jurisdiction, privacy, and human rights. For example, the International Financial Reporting Standards serve as a kind of international GAAP to help companies report financial results in a common accounting language across national boundaries. Despite our best efforts, someone who wishes to conduct business selfishly and unethically always will be drawn to do so unless given a compelling incentive not to. It is evident why Aristotle and Confucius stressed the importance of schooling. Perhaps what is needed now, building on these two ancient approaches, is business education focused on transformation rather than on conformity to guidelines. This proposal touches the core of both Aristotelian and Confucian teachings, training and education. Training and education help internalize in us more altruistic business practices. They also permit greater integration between our personal and professional understandings of the way we should treat friends, family, customers, and clients. No matter the context, we are then encouraged to treat others with honesty and respect, so that even someone certain to get away with the most outrageous corruption or money laundering scheme would not do it. Why not? Because doing so would be a betrayal of the person's conscience and identity. A business education that is truly effective, one for the 21st century, would produce a graduate who could stand up and say no to that kind of self-betrayal. What would you do? Scenario with Aristotle and Confucius. Imagine a scenario in which Aristotle and Confucius sit down to discuss Chiquita Brands International, a global produce conglomerate that paid protection, money to right-wing and Marxist guerrilla groups in Colombia between 1997 and 2004 to ensure there would be no violence against its employees, banana plantations, and facilities. The payment violated the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, 1977, which prohibits bribes and kickbacks to foreign officials. Chiquita claimed it was the victim of extortion and had no choice. However, for its actions, it eventually paid $25 million in fines to the U.S. government. In 2007, a group of Colombians filed a lawsuit against the company under the Alien Tort Claims Act, alleging that, because of its illegal payments, Chiquita was complicit in extrajudicial killings, torture, forced disappearances, and crimes against humanity, perpetrated against plantation workers by the guerrilla death squads. 36. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015, but the court declined to hear it. Critical thinking. What do you suppose Confucius and Aristotle, teachers of virtue ethics, would say about the Colombians' case? And how would they go about assessing responsibility? What would they identify as the crime committed? Would they think the executives at Chiquita had acted prudently, cravenly, or deceitfully? What would you do if confronted with this case? Link to learning. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center provides helpful, detailed information concerning ethics cases and the role of business in society, including more information about the Chiquita lawsuit and other interesting cases. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the principal elements of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, distinguish John Stuart Mill's modification of utilitarianism from Bentham's original formulation of it, evaluate the role of utilitarianism in contemporary business. Although the ultimate aim of Aristotelian virtue ethics was eudaimonia, later philosophers began to question this notion of happiness. If happiness consists of leading the good life, what is good? More importantly, who decides what is good? Jeremy Bentham, 1748–1842, a progressive British philosopher and jurist of the Enlightenment period, advocated for the rights of women, freedom of expression, the abolition of slavery and of the death penalty, and the decriminalization of homosexuality. He believed that the concept of good could be reduced to one simple instinct, the search for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. All human behavior could be explained by reference to this basic instinct, which Bentham saw as the key to unlocking the workings of the human mind. He created an ethical system based on it, called utilitarianism. Bentham's protege, John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873, refined Bentham's system by expanding it to include human rights. In so doing, Mill reworked Bentham's utilitarianism in some significant ways. In this section, we look at both systems. maximizing utility. During Bentham's lifetime, revolutions occurred in the American colonies and in France, producing the Bill of Rights and the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, Declaration of the Rights of Man, both of which were based on liberty, equality, and self-determination. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Revolutionary movements broke out that year in France, Italy, Austria, Poland, and elsewhere. 37 In addition, the Industrial Revolution transformed Great Britain and eventually the rest of Europe from an agrarian, farm-based society into an industrial one, in which steam and coal increased manufacturing production dramatically, changing the nature of work, property ownership, and family. This period also included advances in chemistry, astronomy, navigation, human anatomy, and immunology, among other sciences. Given this historical context, it is understandable that Bentham used reason and science to explain human behavior. His ethical system was an attempt to quantify happiness and the good so they would meet the conditions of the scientific method. Ethics had to be empirical, quantifiable, verifiable, and reproducible across time and space. Just as science was beginning to understand the workings of cause and effect in the body, so ethics would explain the causal relationships of the mind. Bentham rejected religious authority and wrote a rebuttal to the Declaration of Independence in which he railed against natural rights as rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. 38 Instead, the fundamental unit of human action for him was utility, solid, certain, and factual. What is utility? Bentham's fundamental axiom, which underlies utilitarianism, was that all social morals and government legislation should aim for producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism, therefore, emphasizes the consequences or ultimate purpose of an act rather than the character of the actor's motivation, or the particular circumstances surrounding the act. It has these characteristics. 1. Universality, because it applies to all acts of human behavior, even those that appear to be done from altruistic motives. 2. Objectivity, meaning it operates beyond individual thought, desire, and perspective. 3. Rationality, because it is not based in metaphysics or theology. And 4. Quantifiability in its reliance on utility. 39. Ethics across time and cultures. The autoicon. In the spirit of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham made a seemingly bizarre request concerning the disposition of his body after his death. He generously donated half his estate to London University, a public university open to all and offering a secular curriculum, unusual for the times. It later became University College London. Bentham also stipulated that his body be preserved for medical instruction, figure 2.7, and later placed on display in what he called an autoicon, or self-image. The university agreed, and Bentham's body has been on display ever since. Bentham wanted to show the importance of donating one's remains to medical science in what was also perhaps his last act of defiance against convention. Critics insist he was merely eccentric. A drawing depicting Jeremy Bentham's corpse laid out on a table and mostly covered by a sheet. Figure 2.7 At his request, Jeremy Bentham's corpse was laid out for public dissection, as depicted here by H. Pickersgill in 1832. Today, his body is on display as an autoicon at University College, London, a university he endowed with about half his estate. His preserved head is also kept at the college, separate from the rest of the body. Credit: Mortal Remains of Jeremy Bentham, 1832, by Weld Taylor and H. Pickersgill / Wikimedia Commons, CC by 4. 0. Critical thinking. What do you think of Bentham's final request? Is it the act of an eccentric or of someone deeply committed to the truth and courageous enough to act on his beliefs? Do you believe it makes sense to continue to honor Bentham's request today? Why is it honored? Do requests have to make sense? Why or why not? Bentham was interested in reducing utility to a single index so that units of it could be assigned a numerical and even monetary value, which could then be regulated by law. This utility function measures in utils the value of a good, service, or proposed action relative to the utilitarian principle of the greater good, that is, increasing happiness or decreasing pain. Bentham thus created a hedonic calculus to measure the utility of proposed actions according to the conditions of intensity, duration, certainty, and the probability that a certain consequence would result. 40. He intended utilitarianism to provide a reasoned basis for making judgments of value rather than relying on subjectivity, intuition, or opinion. The implications of such a system on law and public policy were profound and had a direct effect on his work with the British House of Commons, where he was commissioned by the Speaker to decide which bills would come up for debate and vote. Utilitarianism provided a way of determining the total amount of utility or value a proposal would produce relative to the harm or pain that might result for society. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. In consequentialism, actions are judged solely by their consequences, without regard to character, motivation, or any understanding of good and evil, and separate from their capacity to create happiness and pleasure. Thus, in utilitarianism, it is the consequences of our actions that determine whether those actions are right or wrong. In this way, consequentialism differs from Aristotelian and Confucian virtue ethics, which can accommodate a range of outcomes as long as the character of the actor is ennobled by virtue. For Bentham, character had nothing to do with the utility of an action. Everyone sought pleasure and avoided pain regardless of personality or morality. In fact, too much reliance on character might obscure decision-making. Rather than making moral judgments, utilitarianism weighed acts based on their potential to produce the most good pleasure for the most people. It judged neither the good nor the people who benefited. In Bentham's mind, no longer would humanity depend on inaccurate and outdated moral codes. For him, utilitarianism reflected the reality of human relationships and was enacted in the world through legislative action. To illustrate the concept of consequentialism, consider the hypothetical story told by Harvard psychologist Fiery Cushman. When a man offends two volatile brothers with an insult, John wants to kill him. He shoots but misses. Matt, who intends only to scare the man but kills him by accident, will suffer a more severe penalty than his brother in most countries, including the United States. Applying utilitarian reasoning, can you say which brother bears greater guilt for his behavior? Are you satisfied with this assessment of responsibility? Why or why not? 41. Link to learning. A classic utilitarian dilemma considers an out-of-control streetcar and a switch operator's array of bad choices. Watch the video on the streetcar thought experiment and consider these questions. How would you go about making the decision about what to do? Is there a right or wrong answer? What values and criteria would you use to make your decision about whom to save? Synthesizing rights and utility. As you might expect, utilitarianism was not without its critics. Thomas Hodgkin, 1780–1869, pointed out what he said was the absurdity of insisting that the rights of man are derived from the legislator and not nature. 42. In a similar vein, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772–1834, accused Bentham of mixing up morality with law. 43. Others objected that utilitarianism placed human beings on the same level as animals and turned people into utility functions. There were also complaints that it was mechanistic, anti-religious, and too impractical for most people to follow. John Stuart Mill sought to answer these objections on behalf of his mentor, but then offered a synthesis of his own that brought natural rights together with utility, creating a new kind of utilitarianism, one that would eventually serve to underpin neoclassical economic principles. 44. Mill's father, James, was a contemporary and associate of Bentham, who made sure his son was tutored in a rigorous curriculum. According to Mill, at an early age he learned enough Greek and Latin to read the historians Herodotus and Tacitus in their original languages. 45. His studies also included algebra, Euclidean geometry, economics, logic, and calculus. 46. His father wanted him to assume a leadership position in Bentham's political movement, known as the Philosophical Radicals. 47. Unfortunately, the intensity and duration of Mill's schooling, utilitarian conditions of education, were so extreme that he suffered a nervous breakdown at the age of 20 years. The experience left him dissatisfied with Bentham's philosophy of utility and social reform. As an alternative, Mill turned to Romanticism and poets like Coleridge and Johann Wolfgang Goethe, 1799–1832. 48. What he ended up with, however, was not a rejection of utilitarianism, but a synthesis of utility and human rights. Why rights? No doubt, Mill's early life and formation had a great deal to do with his championing of individual freedom. He believed the effort to achieve utility was unjustified if it coerced people into doing things they did not want to do. Likewise, the appeal to science as the arbiter of truth would prove just as futile, he believed, if it did not temper facts with compassion. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model, and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree, which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing, he wrote. 49. Mill was interested in humanizing Bentham's system by ensuring that everyone's rights were protected, particularly the minorities, not because rights were God-given, but because that was the most direct path to truth. Therefore, he introduced the harm principle, which states that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. 50. To be sure, there are limitations to Mill's version of utilitarianism, just as there were with the original. For one, there has never been a satisfactory definition of harm, and what one person finds harmful another may find beneficial. For Mill, harm was defined as the setback of one's interests. Thus, harm was defined relative to an individual's interests. But what role, if any, should society play in defining what is harmful or in determining who is harmed by someone's actions? For instance, is society culpable for not intervening in cases of suicide, euthanasia, and other self-destructive activities such as drug addiction? These issues have become part of the public debate in recent years, and most likely will continue to be as such actions are considered in a larger social context. We may also define intervention and coercion differently depending on where we fall on the political spectrum. Considering the social implications of an individual action highlights another limitation of utilitarianism, and one that perhaps makes more sense to us than it would to Bentham and Mill, namely, that it makes no provision for emotional or cognitive harm. If the harm is not measurable in physical terms, then it lacks significance. For example, if a reckless driver today irresponsibly exceeds the speed limit, crashes into a concrete abutment, and kills himself while totaling his vehicle, which he owns, utilitarianism would hold that in the absence of physical harm to others, no one suffers except the driver. We may not arrive at the same conclusion. Instead, we might hold that the driver's survivors and friends, along with society as a whole, have suffered a loss. Arguably, all of us are diminished by the recklessness of his act. Link to learning. Watch this video for a summary of utilitarian principles, along with a literary example of a central problem of utility, and an explanation of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. The role of utilitarianism in contemporary business. Utilitarianism is used frequently when business leaders make critical decisions about things like expansion, store closings, hiring, and layoffs. They do not necessarily refer to a utilitarian calculus, but whenever they take stock of what is to be gained and what might be lost in any significant decision, e.g., in a cost-benefit analysis, they make a utilitarian determination. At the same time, one might argue that a simple cost-benefits analysis is not a utilitarian calculus unless it includes consideration of all stakeholders and a full accounting of externalities, worker preferences, potentially coercive actions related to customers, or community and environmental effects. As a practical way of measuring value, Bentham's system also plays a role in risk management. The utility function, or the potential for benefit or loss, can be translated into decision-making, risk assessment, and strategic planning. Together with data analytics, market evaluations, and financial projections, the utility function can provide managers with a tool for measuring the viability of prospective projects. It may even give them an opportunity to explore objections about the mechanistic and impractical nature of utilitarianism, especially from a customer perspective. Utilitarianism could motivate individuals within the organization to take initiative, become more responsible, and act in ways that enhance the organization's reputation rather than tarnish it. Mill, S. on Liberty, Figure 2. 8. A short treatment of political freedoms in tension with the power of the state underscored the importance of expression and free speech, which Mill saw not as one right among many, but as the foundational right, reflective of human nature, from which all others' rights derive their meaning. And therein lay the greatest utility for society and business. For Mill, the path to utility led through truth, and the main way of arriving at truth was through a deliberative process that encouraged individual expression and the clash of ideas. Part A shows a print copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Part B shows John Stuart Mill. Figure 2.8 in On Liberty, 1859. A. John Stuart Mill. B. Combined utility with human rights. He emphasized the importance of free speech for correcting error and creating value for the individual and society. Credit, a modification of On Liberty, first edition title page via facsimile, by Yadin/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B, modification of John Stuart Mill by London Stereoscopic Company, c. 1870 by Sewing/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. As for Mill's harm principle, the first question in trying to arrive at a business decision might be, does this action harm others? If the answer is yes, we must make a utilitarian calculation to decide whether there is still a greater good for the greatest number. Then we must ask, who are the others we must consider? All stakeholders? Only shareholders? What does harm entail, and who decides whether a proposed action might be harmful? This was the reason science and debate were so important to Mill, because the determination could not be left to public opinion or intuition. That was how tyranny started. By introducing deliberation, Mill was able to balance utility with freedom, which was a necessary condition for utility. Where Bentham looked to numerical formulas for determining value, relying on the objectivity of numbers, Mill sought value in reason and in the power of language to clarify where truth lies. The lesson for contemporary business, especially with the rise of big data, is that we need both numbers and reason principles. If we apply the Aristotelian and Confucian rule of the mean, we see that balance of responsibility and profitability makes the difference between sound business practices and poor ones. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain Immanuel Kant's concept of duty and the categorical imperative, differentiate between utilitarianism and deontology, apply a model of Kantian business ethics. Unlike Bentham and Mill, Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, was not concerned with consequences of one's actions or the harm caused to one's individual interests. Instead, he focused on motives and the willingness of individuals to act for the good of others, even though that action might result in personal loss. Doing something for the right reason was much more important to Kant than any particular outcome. Aroused from dogmatic slumber. In 1781, at the age of 56 years, Kant published Critique of Pure Reason, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, in Königsberg, Prussia, Figure 29. 51. Almost immediately, it transformed him from an obscure professor of metaphysics and logic into a preeminent figure in the world of philosophy. In the 800-page tome, Kant criticized the way rationalism, pure reason, had assumed the mantle of absolute truth, supplanting both religious faith and empirical science. Kant referred to the unquestioned acceptance of rationalism as dogmatism. Whether Christian or revolutionary, dogmatic thinking was to be avoided because it obscured the truths of science and religion through flawed logic. Part A shows a painting depicting Immanuel Kant. Part B shows a print copy of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, written in German. Figure 2. 9. First published in 1781, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason provided a new system for understanding experience and reality. It defended religious faith against atheism and the scientific method against the skepticism of the Enlightenment. Credit, a modification of Immanuel Kant, 1724-1804, by Dobe Os Berblingen, /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of title page of 1781 edition of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, by Tomisti, /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Kant credited the skepticism of empirical philosopher David Hume, 1711-1776, with awakening him from dogmatic slumber, although he disagreed with Hume, who claimed that the mind did not exist at all, but was the result of mental associations derived from sensory experience. 52. For Kant, reality could be discerned not through reasoning or sensory experience alone, but only by understanding the nature of the human mind. Kant argued that sensory experience did not create the mind, but rather that the mind created experience through its internal structures. And within the mind's complex structures, there also existed an inherent and unconditional duty to act ethically, which Kant called the categorical imperative, first outlined in Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, 1785. 53. In its initial form, Kant described his concept of the categorical imperative as follows: act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. 54. Kant's categorical, or unconditional, imperative has practical applications for the study of ethics. The categorical imperative contains two major suppositions. 1. We must act on the basis of goodwill rather than purely on self-interested motives that benefit ourselves at the expense of others. 2. We must never treat others as means toward ends benefiting ourselves without consideration of them also as ends in themselves. Kant held that observing the categorical imperative, as we consider what actions to take, would directly lead to ethical actions on our part. Link to learning. Watch this video about the categorical imperative to learn more. How do you see the imperative working in your own life, within your family, in your personal and professional relationships? Does Kant's understanding of the relationship between art and beauty accord with your own? In Kant's view, rationalism and empiricism prevented people from perceiving the truth about their own nature. What was that truth? What was sufficient to constitute it? Kant identified an a priori world of knowledge and understanding in which truth lay in the structures and categories of the mind that were beyond perception and reason. This was a radical concept for the times. In the end, Kant's systematic analysis of knowing and understanding provided a much-needed counterweight to the logic of Enlightenment rationalism. The existence of the mental structures he proposed has even been confirmed today. For instance, the scientific consensus is that humans are born with cognitive structures designed specifically for language acquisition and development. Even more surprising, there may be similar cognitive structures for morality, conscience, and moral decision-making. 55. So, it is quite possible that conscience, if not happiness, may have a genetic component after all, although Kant himself did not believe the categories of the understanding or the a priori structures of the mind were biological. Link to learning. Read a good survey of Kant's critique of Enlightenment rationalism and of empiricism in this article. Utilitarianism and deontology. From a Kantian perspective, it is clear that adherence to duty is what builds the framework for ethical acts. This is in direct contradiction of Bentham's view of human nature as selfish and requiring an objective calculus for ethical action to result. Kant rejected the idea of such a calculus and believed instead that perceptions were organized into pre-existing categories or structures of the mind. Compare his notion of an ordered and purposeful universe of laws with the similar logos, or logic, of the ancient Greeks. One of those laws included implementation of the categorical imperative to act ethically, in accordance with our conscience. However, even though that imperative ought to be followed without exception, not everyone does so. In Kant's moral teachings, individuals still had free will to accept or reject it. There is a definite contrast between utilitarianism, even Mill's version, and Kant's system of ethics, known as deontology, in which duty, obligation, and good will are of the highest importance. The word is derived from the Greek deon, meaning duty, and logos again, here meaning organization for the purpose of study. 56. An ethical decision requires us to observe only the rights and duties we owe to others, and in the context of business, act on the basis of a primary motive to do what is right by all stakeholders. Kant was not concerned with utility or outcome. His was not a system directed toward results. The question for him was not how to attain happiness, but how to become worthy of it. Rather like Aristotle and Confucius, Kant taught that the transcendent aspects of human nature, if followed, would lead us inevitably to treat people as ends rather than means. To be moral meant to renounce uninformed dogmatism and rationalism, abide by the categorical imperative, and embrace freedom, moral sense, and even divinity. This was not a lofty or unattainable goal in Kant's mind, because these virtues constituted part of the systematic structuring of the human mind. It could be accomplished by living truthfully, or, as we say today, authentically. Such a feat transcended the logic of both rationalism and empiricism. What would you do? Les Miserables. You may have seen the very popular Broadway show or movie Les Miserables, based on Victor Hugo's epic 19th-century French novel of the same name. The main character, Jean Valjean, steals a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving family and is arrested and sent to prison. If we apply conventional reasoning and principles of law to his crime, Valjean genuinely is guilty as charged, and we do not need to consider any extenuating circumstances. However, in a Kantian ethical framework, we would take into account Valjean's motives, as well as his duty to treat his sister's family as ends in themselves who deserve to live. Valjean's fate demonstrates what might occur when there is a gap between the legal and the moral. Clearly, Valjean broke the law by stealing the bread. However, he acted morally by correcting a wrong and possibly saving human lives. According to Kantian ethics, Valjean may have been ethical in stealing bread for his family, particularly because the action was grounded in goodwill and provided benefit to others more than to himself. Critical thinking. It has been said that in Kantian ethics, duty comes before beauty and morality before happiness. Can you think of other instances when it is appropriate to break one moral code to satisfy another, perhaps greater one? What are the deciding factors in each case? What would you do if you were Jean Valjean? Kantian business ethics. Unlike utilitarianism, which forms the philosophical foundation for most cost-benefit analysis in business, Kantian ethics is not so easily applied. On one hand, it offers a unique opportunity for the development of individual morality through the categorical imperative to act ethically, which emphasizes humanity and autonomy. 57. This imperative addresses one major side of business ethics, the personal. Character and moral formation are crucial to creating an ethical culture. Indeed, business ethics is littered with cases of companies that have suffered damaging crises due to their leaders' lack of commitment to act on the basis of a goodwill and with regard for what benefits others. Recent examples include Uber, where a toxic work environment was allowed to prevail, and Volkswagen, which knowingly misrepresented the emissions level of its cars. 58 such examples exist in government as well, as the recent Theranos and Fat Leonard scandals confirm. 59. The latter consisted of graft and corruption in the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet and has been a continual source of embarrassment for an institution that prides itself on the honorable conduct of its officers. One person can make a difference, either positively or negatively. On the other hand, Kant's categorical imperative is just that, categorical or unconditional. It calls for morally upright behavior regardless of external circumstance or the historical context of a proposed act or decision. Kant affirmed that the moral law is an imperative, which commands categorically, because the law is unconditioned. 60. Unconditional ethics could be a challenge for a global organization dealing with suppliers, customers, and competitors in sometimes vastly different cultures. It raises a larger philosophical issue. Namely, was Kant correct in believing that morality and mental categories are independent of experience? Or can they be culturally conditioned, and if so, does that make them relative rather than absolute, as Kant believed them to be? This question whether ethics is universal is distinctly Kantian, because Kant believed that not only must a moral agent act with others' interests in mind and have the right intentions, but also that the action be universally applicable. Think of how Kantian ethics might be applied not just on an individual level, but throughout an organization, and then society. Kant would judge a corporate act to be ethical if it benefited others at the same time it benefited company leadership and stockholders, and if it did not place their interests above those of other stakeholders. If loyalty to a coworker conflicted with loyalty to a supervisor or the organization, for instance, then acts resulting from such loyalty might not meet the conditions of deontology. Either the supervisor or the company would be treated as a means rather than an end. Although the qualitative or humanizing element of Kantian ethics has broad appeal, it runs into limitations in an actual business setting. Whether the limitations have good or bad effects depends on the organization's culture and leadership. In general, however, most companies do not adhere to strict Kantian theories because they look to the outcome of their decisions rather than focusing on motives or intentions. Cases from the real world. Samsung. In the fall of 2016, Samsung Electronics experienced a massive public relations disaster when its Galaxy Note 7 smartphone started exploding due to faulty batteries and casings. Initially, the company denied there were any technical problems. Then, when it became obvious the exploding phones posed a safety and health threat, they were banned from airplanes. Samsung accused its suppliers of creating the problem. In reality, the rush to beat Apple's iPhone 7 release date was the most likely reason corners were cut in production. Samsung finally owned up to the problem, recalled more than 2 million phones worldwide, and replaced them with new, improved Galaxy Note 7s. The company's response and its replacement of the phones went a long way toward diffusing the disaster and even boosting the company's share price. Whether management knew it, its response was Kantian. Samsung focused on the end, i.e., customer safety and satisfaction, with the motive of doing the ethically responsible thing. Although some might argue the company could have done far more and much more quickly, perhaps it still acted in accordance with the categorical imperative. What do you think, critical thinking? How might the categorical imperative become a part of organizational culture? Could it ever work in business? Do you see the categorical imperative as applicable to your own interests and hope for a career? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to evaluate John Rawls's answer to utilitarianism. Analyze the problem of redistribution. Apply justice theory in a business context. This chapter began with an image of justice, holding aloft scales as a symbol of equilibrium and fairness. It ends with an American political philosopher for whom the equal distribution of resources was a primary concern. John Rawls, 1921-2002, wanted to change the debate that had prevailed throughout the 1960s and 1970s in the West about how to maximize wealth for everyone. He sought not to maximize wealth, which was a utilitarian goal, but to establish justice as the criterion by which goods and services were distributed among the populace. Justice, for Rawls, had to do with fairness. In fact, he frequently used the expression justice as fairness, and his concept of fairness was a political one that relied on the state to take care of the most disadvantaged. In his justice theory, offered as an alternative to the dominant utilitarianism of the times, the idea of fairness applied beyond the individual to include the community as well as analysis of social injustice, with remedies to correct it. Justice theory. Rawls developed a theory of justice based on the Enlightenment ideas of thinkers like John Locke, 1632-1704, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712-1778, who advocated social contract theory. Social contract theory held that the natural state of human beings was freedom, but that human beings will rationally submit to some restrictions on their freedom to secure their mutual safety and benefit, not subjugation to a monarch, no matter how benign or well-intentioned. This idea parallels that of Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, who interpreted human nature to be selfish and brutish to the degree that, absent the strong hand of a ruler, chaos would result. So people willingly consent to transfer their autonomy to the control of a sovereign so their very lives and property will be secured. Rousseau rejected that view, as did Rawls, who expanded social contract theory to include justice as fairness. In A Theory of Justice, 1971, Rawls introduced a universal system of fairness and a set of procedures for achieving it. He advocated a practical, empirically verifiable system of governance that would be political, social, and economic in its effects. Rawls's justice theory contains 3 principles and 5 procedural steps for achieving fairness. The principles are 1. An original position, 2. A veil of ignorance, and 3. Unanimity of acceptance of the original position. 61. By original position, Rawls meant something akin to Hobbes' understanding of the state of nature, a hypothetical situation in which rational people can arrive at a contractual agreement about how resources are to be distributed in accordance with the principles of justice as fairness. This agreement was intended to reflect not present reality, but a desired state of affairs among people in the community. The veil of ignorance, figure 210, is a condition in which people arrive at the original position, imagining they have no identity regarding age, sex, ethnicity, education, income, physical attractiveness, or other characteristics. In this way, they reduce their bias and self-interest. Last, unanimity of acceptance is the requirement that all agree to the contract before it goes into effect. Rawls hoped this justice theory would provide a minimum guarantee of rights and liberties for everyone, because no one would know until the veil was lifted, whether they were male, female, rich, poor, tall, short, intelligent, a minority, Roman Catholic, disabled, a veteran, and so on. The 5 procedural steps, or conjectures, are 1. Entering into the contract, 2. Agreeing unanimously to the contract, 3. Including basic conditions in the contract such as freedom of speech, 4. Maximizing the welfare of the most disadvantaged persons, and 5. Ensuring the stability of the contract. 62. These steps create a system of justice that Rawls believed gave fairness its proper place above utility and the bottom line. The steps also supported his belief in people's instinctual drive for fairness and equitable treatment. Perhaps this is best seen in an educational setting, for example, the university. By matriculating, students enter into a contract that includes basic freedoms such as assembly and speech. Students at a disadvantage, e.g., those burdened with loans, jobs, or other financial constraints, are accommodated as well as possible. The contract between the university and students has proven to be stable over time, from generation to generation. This same procedure applies on a micro level to the experience in the classroom between an individual teacher and students. Over the past several decades, for better or worse, the course syllabus has assumed the role of a written contract expressing this relationship. Rawls gave an example of what he called pure procedural justice, in which a cake is shared among several people. 63. By what agreement shall the cake be divided? Rawls determined that the best way to divide the cake is to have the person slicing the cake take the last piece. This will ensure that everyone gets an equal amount. What is important is an independent standard to determine what is just and a procedure for implementing it. 64. The problem of redistribution. Part of Rawls's critique of utilitarianism is that its utility calculus can lead to tyranny. If we define pleasure as that which is popular, the minority can suffer in terrible ways and the majority become mere numbers. This became clear in Mills's attempt to humanize Bentham's calculus, but Mills's harm principle had just as bad an effect, for the opposite reason. It did not require anyone to give up anything if it had to be done through coercion or force. To extend Rawls's cake example, if one person owned a bakery and another were starving, like Jean Valjean's sister in Les Miserables, utilitarianism would force the baker to give up what he had to satisfy the starving person without taking into account whether the baker had greater debts, a sick spouse requiring medical treatment, or a child with educational loans. In other words, the context of the situation matters, as opposed to just the consequences. However, Mill's utilitarianism, adhering to the harm principle, would leave the starving person to his or her own devices. At least he or she would have one slice of cake. This was the problem of distribution and redistribution that Rawls hoped to solve, not by calculating pleasure and pain, profit and loss, but by applying fairness as a normative value that would benefit individuals and society. 65. The problem with this approach is that justice theory is a radical, egalitarian form of liberalism, in which redistribution of material goods and services occurs without regard for historical context, or the presumption many share that it inherently is wrong to take the property legally acquired by one and distribute it to another. Rawls has been criticized for promoting the same kind of coercion that can exist in utilitarianism, but on the basis of justice rather than pleasure. Justice on a societal level would guarantee housing, education, medical treatment, food, and the basic necessities of life for everyone. Yet, as recent political campaigns have shown, the question of who will pay for these guaranteed goods and services through taxes is a contentious one. These are not merely fiscal and political issues. They are philosophical ones requiring us to answer questions of logic and, especially in the case of justice theory, fairness. And naturally, we must ask, what is fair? Rawls's principles and steps assume that the way in which the redistribution of goods and services occurs would be agreed upon by people in the community to avoid any fairness issues. But questions remain. For one, Rawls's justice, like the iconic depiction, is blind and cannot see the circumstances in which goods and services are distributed. Second, we may question whether a notion of fairness is really innate. Third, despite the claim that justice theory is not consequentialist, meaning outcomes are not the only thing that matters. There is a coercive aspect to Rawls's justice once the contract is in force, replacing utility with mandated fairness. Fourth, is this the kind of system in which people thrive and prosper? Or, by focusing on the worst off, are initiative, innovation, and creativity dampened on the part of everyone else? Perhaps the most compelling critic of Rawls in this regard was his colleague at Harvard University, Robert Nozick, 1938-2002, who wrote A Theory of Entitlement, 1974, as a direct rebuttal of Rawlsian justice theory. 66 Nozick argued that the power of the state may never ethically be used to deprive someone of property he or she has legally obtained or inherited in order to distribute it to others who are in need of it. Still, one of the advantages of justice theory over the other ethical systems presented in this chapter is its emphasis on method as opposed to content. The system runs on a methodology or process for arriving at truth through the underlying value of fairness. Again, in this sense it is similar to utilitarianism, but by requiring unanimity, it avoids the extremes of Bentham's and Mill's versions. As a method in ethics, it can be applied in a variety of ways and in multiple disciplines, because it can be adapted to just about any value-laden content. Of course, this raises the question of content versus method in ethics, especially because ethics has been defined as a set of cultural norms based on agreed-upon values. Method may be most effective in determining what those underlying values are, rather than how they are implemented. An illustration depicts a basic figure of a person, all in gray. The figure is labeled original position. To the right of the figure is a wall labeled veil of ignorance. On the other side of the wall to the right are 8 figures with more details than the first. One figure has medium to light skin tone and a dress. One has medium to dark skin tone and a cane. One has light skin tone. One has light skin tone and a service dog. One has medium to dark skin tone. One has medium to light skin tone and a dress with a $sign on it. One has dark skin tone and a dress. One has dark skin tone and is in a wheelchair. Figure 2. 10. The veil of ignorance in Rawls's original position. Those in the original position have no idea who they will be once the veil wall has been lifted. Rawls thought such ignorance would motivate people in the community to choose fairly. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. Link to learning. The veil of ignorance is a central concept in Rawls's justice theory. What is it? What does it attempt to accomplish? Watch this video on how ignorance can improve decision-making to explore further. Justice in business. Although no ethical framework is perfect or fits a particular era completely, Rawls's justice theory has distinct advantages when applied to business in the 21st century. First, as businesses become interdependent and globalized, they must pay more attention to quality control, human resources, and leadership in diverse settings. What will give greater legitimacy to an organization in these areas than fairness? Fairness is a value that is cross-cultural, embraced by different social groups, and understood by nearly everyone. However, what is considered fair depends on a variety of factors, including underlying values and individual characteristics like personality. For instance, not everyone agrees on whether or how diversity ought to be achieved. Neither is there consensus about affirmative action or the redistribution of resources or income. What is fair to some may be supremely unfair to others. This presents an opportunity for engaged debate and participation among the members of Rawls's community. Second, as we saw earlier, justice theory provides a method for attaining fairness, which could make it a practical and valuable part of training at all levels of a company. The fact that its content, justice and fairness, is more accessible to contemporary people than Confucian virtue ethics and more flexible than Kant's categorical imperative makes it an effective way of dealing with stakeholders and organizational culture. Justice theory may also provide a seamless way of engaging in corporate social responsibility outwardly and employee development inwardly. Fairness as a corporate doctrine can be applied to all stakeholders and define a culture of trust and openness, with all the corresponding benefits in marketing, advertising, board development, client relations, and so on. It is also an effective way of integrating business ethics into the organization, so ethics is no longer seen as the responsibility solely of the compliance department or legal team. Site leaders and middle managers understand fairness, employees probably even more so, because they are more directly affected by the lack of it. Fairness, then, is as much part of the job as it is an ongoing process of an ethics system. It no doubt makes for a happier and more productive workforce. An organization dedicated to it can also play a greater role in civic life and the political process, which, in turn, helps everyone. What would you do? John Rawls's thought experiment. John Rawls's original position represents a community in which you have no idea what kind of person you will end up being. In this sense, it is like life itself. After all, you have no idea what your future will be like. You could end up rich, poor, married, single, living in Manhattan or Peru. You might be a surgeon or fishing for sturgeon. Yet there is one community you will most likely be a part of at some point, the aged. Given that you know this but are not sure of the details, which conditions would you agree to now so that senior citizens are provided for? Remember that you most likely will join them and experience the effects of what you decide now. You are living behind not a spatial veil of ignorance, but a temporal one. Critical thinking. What are you willing to give up so that seniors, whoever they might be, are afforded care and security in their later years? Should you have to pay into a system that provides medical coverage to other people less health conscious than you? Why or why not?